Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. What do you swear you saw but have no proof? Story 1. Silent Warning.
It was a crisp, clear morning when my dad and I decided to go on one of our regular hiking trips. I was around 15 or 16 years old, still young enough to feel the thrill of adventure, and yet just old enough to start understanding the raw power of nature. We had hiked on that trail several times before, and it was one of our favorite spots, quiet, remote, and peaceful. We would go out early to avoid the crowds, usually ending up with the trail almost entirely to ourselves. That morning, something felt different. As we walked along the familiar path, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air felt thick, almost charged. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds seemed quieter, more distant. It was like the forest had drawn a deep breath and was holding it in. A feeling of unease began to settle over me, and before I even knew it, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing at full attention. I felt a deep, unsettling sensation in the pit of my stomach, like something was wrong. But I couldn't pinpoint what. I tried to shake it off at first, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then it hit me. The feeling. It wasn't just nervousness or the usual discomfort of hiking alone in the wild. It was something far worse. It was as if the entire forest had gone quiet, as if it was aware of something I wasn't. I began to feel like I was being watched. My heart started to race, and I felt the urge to run. But my feet kept moving forward, one step after another, almost automatically. "Hey, Dad," I called out, my voice shaky. He was a few steps ahead of me, moving as casually as always, but I knew he had to feel it too. "I really think we should go back to the van," I said, my voice tight with fear. My mind raced with all the possible dangers in the wilderness. The snakes, the bears, but the feeling of dread was too specific, too sharp. I couldn't explain it, but I needed to get out of there. My dad, who had been the epitome of calm and confident ever since I could remember, stopped in his tracks. I could see him pause, as though considering something. He slowly turned around and looked at me. His eyes were wide, not with panic, but with a rare kind of understanding, like he knew exactly what I was feeling. "Me too," he said in a low, serious tone. That simple reply hit me like a freight train. Superman isn't supposed to be afraid, I thought to myself. My dad, the rock of the family, had just acknowledged that he too felt something was wrong. I looked at him, searching for any hint of doubt, but there was none. His calm demeanor, normally a reassurance, now added to the unease that gripped my chest. It was as though the same primal instinct was running through both of us. Something that couldn't be ignored or explained away. We didn't need to exchange another word. We turned on our heels and started to head back down the trail. But the dread didn't leave us. It clung to me, growing heavier with each step. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced something was following us, lurking just out of sight. The forest seemed to grow even quieter, as though it too was holding its breath. As we made our way back to the parking area, we didn't speak much. The unsettling feeling lingered in the air between us. We reached the van, and as I slid into the seat, I could finally exhale. My dad started the engine, and we drove in silence, the hum of the road the only sound. The next morning, we saw the news report. It was a story about a hiker who had been attacked by a mountain lion on the very same trail we had been on, just a little farther up from where we had turned back. The hair on the back of my neck stood up all over again as I read the details. The attack had been brutal, and the hiker was lucky to have survived. My dad and I exchanged a look, one of mutual understanding. We both knew that what we had felt wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, a warning, an instinctual sense that we had been in danger. It wasn't until later that day, as we talked about it, that we realized how close we had come. The mountain lion's presence hadn't been visible to us, but somehow our instincts had picked up on its presence. In that moment, we had felt the weight of its eyes on us, sensing the predator long before we were aware of its physical location. To this day, neither of us has forgotten that feeling. It wasn't just an eerie moment in the woods. It was a reminder of the power of nature, the deep, instinctual knowledge we all carry within us, and the fact that sometimes our bodies know danger long before our minds do. And even though I never found a way to fully explain it, that experience has stayed with me. There's something about that primal connection we have with the world around us. The way we can sense danger before we can see it. That's both terrifying and awe-inspiring. And now, whenever I go out into the wilderness, I listen a little more closely and trust a little more deeply the warnings that come from within.
Story 2. Watching in the Woods.
My story takes place in the northeastern United States, and I was around 6 or 7 years old at the time, which I know might make it hard to believe. But I have solid memories from that age, as do many others. It would have been in the early 2000s. My mother and her boyfriend at the time decided to visit one of his friends who lived in a very rural area. The house was surrounded by thick forest on both sides, a place I had never been before. The friend was already outside, so the adults began chatting in the driveway, leaving me bored with their conversation. I started looking around, more interested in the dense woods surrounding the property. The trees were so thick they blocked out most of the sunlight, casting a heavy shadow over the ground. Curiosity got the best of me, and I wandered into the forest. I ventured about 70 to 100 feet before I started to feel strange. My senses began to tingle, and I felt like something was watching me. Goosebumps crept up my arms and neck. I tried to ignore the feeling, chalking it up to the unnerving darkness in the woods. But then, something changed. I heard a rustling sound in the trees ahead of me, but it wasn't just the usual sounds of wind or small animals. This was fast, heavy, and getting closer. I paused, straining to listen, and realized the rustling wasn't coming from a random spot. It was coming straight at me. The trees in front of me began to move in a zigzag pattern, as if something large was jumping from tree to tree, quickly closing the distance. My mind raced. I imagined something wild and dangerous, like a baboon showing its fangs, ready to attack. Panic hit me, and my body kicked into survival mode. I turned and ran as fast as I could, hearing the heavy crashing behind me. Whatever it was following, closing in. I could hear it pushing through the trees, and I felt its presence right behind me, as if it was chasing me. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted back toward the driveway, only stopping when I was just a few feet from safety. The moment I reached the driveway, I stopped stopped and stood there, trying to catch my breath. My arms still tingled with fear, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know what I had just experienced, but I knew one thing for sure: it wasn't a squirrel. Whatever it was big, fast, and terrifying. I'll never forget that feeling.
Story 3. Silent Hill.
This happened years ago. My husband and I were moving cross-country in the United States, and we had spent a couple of nights at his grandparents' place in Topeka, Kansas, which is on the far east side of the state. After a couple of days of snow, it was a little cloudy, but there was no fog. We left to drive across the width of Kansas to Colorado, where we would be staying with my grandmother for a couple of days. Less than 5 miles outside Topeka, we were swallowed by the thickest, densest fog I've ever experienced, including when I regularly drove through fog-heavy Half Moon Bay in California. There was no one on our side of the highway, and no one was coming the other direction. For hours, for the first 3 to 4 hours, maybe one car passed going the other direction. But it was just thick fog. We pulled aside once, not even to get gas, but just to get snacks and use the restroom. The gas station was lit up, but there were no cars parked around it. And we could see inside, and there were no people inside. We watched for about 10 to 15 minutes with no signs of life. We ended up just leaving because it was so eerie. I cannot express enough how empty it was. When we talk about it, we usually call it Silent Kansas after the Silent Hill games, because there was just nothing but the thick fog and a sense of foreboding. We drove for hours across Kansas, and the fog did not lift or lessen. We did not see another living being. There were no signs, which I know are usually there, for gas stations or restaurants. It was just empty nothingness in the fog. Then we crossed the state border into Colorado, and within about 2 miles, before even hitting the mountains. So we were at the same altitude as we'd been before entering Colorado. The fog was gone, the sky was clear and blue, and there were multiple cars on the highway going both directions. We both experienced it, but we will never be able to prove it happened because it was before the era of ubiquitous smartphones, and neither of us had the ability to record it at the time. It remains one of the most terrifying and inexplicable experiences I've ever had.
Story 4. Unseen Presence.
It was 5 in the morning, and the world was still asleep as I set off for my usual morning jog. The streets were quiet, with only the soft sound of my sneakers tapping the pavement as I ran. I always enjoyed jogging early. It was peaceful, calm, and there was something refreshing about the silence of the early hours. I passed by my regular spots, the park, the coffee shop, and then I reached the church at the end of the block. It was one of those old churches with tall Gothic arches and a statue of the Virgin Mary right out front. I had always felt a sense of calm whenever I passed by the church, and that morning I felt a sudden urge to stop and pray. It wasn't unusual for me to take a moment of reflection during my jogs, so I slowed down, approached the statue, and stood there for a moment, taking in the stillness of the morning air. As I stood in front of the statue, I noticed an elderly lady praying at the base of it, her head bent, hands clasped, muttering softly to herself. I didn't think much of it at first. I've always been someone who respects others' space, so I simply took my place beside her and closed my eyes, beginning my own prayer. The air felt cold against my skin, but the stillness of the moment was strangely comforting. As I prayed, I suddenly heard something that made my stomach drop, the unmistakable sound of quiet sobbing. I assumed the elderly lady was crying, so I opened my eyes to see if she needed help. But when I looked over to her, she was gone. Just gone. She wasn't kneeling at the statue anymore. The spot where she had been was completely empty. I stood there frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My mind raced. Had I imagined her? Maybe I hadn't seen her clearly in the dim light. I convinced myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But the unease started creeping up my spine as the silence pressed in around me. Shaking off the odd feeling, I decided to continue with my jog. I wasn't about to let some strange moment ruin my workout, so I started running again, pushing the strange occurrence to the back of my mind. The fog of early morning still hung in the air, and the quietness of the streets made it feel like I was the only person alive in the whole world. But then, as I ran down the street, I heard something behind me. It was faint at first, just a soft shuffling sound, almost like footsteps. I slowed my pace, thinking it might be someone else out for an early morning walk. I turned around, half expecting to see another jogger or maybe someone walking their dog. But instead, there she was, the elderly lady. She was standing at the edge of the churchyard, facing me, and her eyes were fixed directly on me. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something unsettling about the way she stood still, motionless, staring without a word. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know how she had gotten there. I didn't hear her approach, and she hadn't been there when I first stopped to pray. The confusion and terror hit me all at once. I didn't want to stick around to figure out how she had reappeared. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, and I didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, I turned and bolted down the street, pushing my legs as fast as they could go. The sound of my breath filled my ears as I ran, and all I could think about was getting as far away from that church as possible. I didn't dare look back, but the thought of her following me, watching me, haunted every step I took. It was the most intense jog I had ever had, every muscle in my body burning with adrenaline, every second feeling like a lifetime. I didn't stop running until I felt far enough away to catch my breath and calm down. As I stood there, my chest heaving with exertion, I couldn't shake the image of her staring at me from the churchyard. What had just happened? Who was she? How had she vanished so quickly and reappeared without a sound? I never got the answers, and to this day I'm not sure if I'll ever understand what I saw that morning. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget the fear that gripped me when I turned around and saw her staring back at me.
Story 5. Man in the Doorway.
When I was 10 years old, my father passed away. It was an incredibly difficult time, filled with confusion, grief, and a lot of changes in my life. A few months after his death, I was lying in bed, nearly asleep, with the light off in my room. The only illumination in the room came from the hallway light, which was on, and the door was left slightly ajar. Normally I found comfort in the soft glow of the hallway light, but on this night, that comfort quickly turned to fear. As I lay there, trying to fall asleep, I glanced up and saw something that made my heart race. There was a man standing in my doorway. He didn't walk into the room. One moment, the doorway was empty, and the next, there he was. He was standing tall, nearly as tall as the door frame itself. I couldn't make out any details. It was just a dark, solid silhouette of a man. But there was something unmistakable about him. I could see that he was wearing a tall, wide-brimmed hat, almost like a top hat. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see his eyes, large, bright, and almost glowing yellow. The eyes were so striking, I thought they might have been radiating light. At 10 years old, I was absolutely terrified. My body went cold, and I felt frozen under the weight of my fear. Without thinking, I pulled the blanket over my head, hoping to shield myself from whatever was there. I convinced myself it had to be a dream, that it wasn't real. But when I finally gathered the courage to peek out from under the blanket, I froze again. His face, those yellow eyes, were now inches from mine. It was as if he was hovering above me, levitating just above me. His eyes seemed to pierce right through me, staring, peering into me, as if he could see everything. I don't remember how the rest of the night went. The fear consumed me, and I must have eventually fallen asleep, though I didn't feel safe. The next morning I tried to push the whole thing out of my mind, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. Years passed and I didn't think much about it again, until one day I randomly told my mother about what had happened. As I recounted the story, I noticed her expression change. Her face went pale, and she looked like she was deep in thought. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "So you saw him too?" We talked about it, and she revealed something I never knew. That night, she had seen a man outside the house, standing in the yard. She said he was wearing a top hat and something that looked like a cloak or cape. She only saw him for a moment, but she distinctly remembered him staring at the house. She went to grab her gun, thinking she might need to protect herself, but by the time she returned, he was gone. She said she thought she was hallucinating, that maybe it was just the stress of everything. But hearing her describe it sent chills down my spine. What were the odds that we had both seen the same thing that night? It couldn't have been a coincidence. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know I'll never forget the way his eyes stared into me that night.
Story 6. Reflection of my mom.
When I was around 7 or 8 years old, I had an experience that still leaves me feeling a little unsettled. My family and I lived in a small condominium at the time, and I remember it being a place that felt familiar and safe. One morning I was heading downstairs, half awake, probably still groggy from just waking up. My mom was standing at the top of the stairs and she smiled at me as I made my way down. I saw her walk toward her bedroom and shut the door behind her, following the usual routine. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But what happened next has always haunted me. As I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned the corner into the kitchen, I saw my mum standing at the counter, chopping carrots. It didn't make any sense. I had just seen her walk into her bedroom and close the door. How could she be in 2 places at once? I stared at her, my heart racing, trying to process what I had just witnessed. I even called out to her, and she looked up, acknowledging me as if everything was normal. I immediately rushed back up the stairs, convinced I had to be imagining things. But I wasn't tired enough for that kind of confusion. I went to my mom and asked her about it, but she just laughed it off, saying I must have been daydreaming. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Was I seeing things, or had I witnessed something that defied explanation? Over the years, I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind or an odd coincidence, but to this day I can't figure out what happened. I've told my mum about it again as an adult, but she still laughs about it, not understanding why it still bothers me. But I'll never forget that strange moment of seeing my mum in two places at once. A few years later, I had an experience that I still can't explain away, and this one still blows my mind. It happened one summer when I was hanging out with my best friend. We were at her house, which was a pretty old place, and she had just gotten a Ouija board as a gift. We had both heard all the stories about Ouija boards, but we didn't take them too seriously. We thought it would just be a fun, spooky way to spend the evening. At first, nothing happened. We sat down at the table, placed our fingers on the planchette, and waited for something to happen. We had heard stories of how the planchette could move on its own, but we figured we'd just be messing around with it for a bit, and nothing more. We waited patiently for a while, trying to stay calm, but nothing came. We were getting a little bored, but something told us to hang in there. Then, after what felt like 45 minutes of nothing, things started getting strange. The planchette began to move on its own, very slowly at first, and then more deliberately. It was like it had a mind of its own, but it wasn't just moving randomly. It was moving in a way that seemed to respond directly to what we were thinking. The first thing that made my blood run cold was when it started answering questions before we even asked them. It was as though the board was reading our minds. I wasn't pushing the planchette. I could feel it move, but it wasn't me moving it. And my best friend said she wasn't moving it either. We were both sitting there, looking at each other in disbelief, as the planchette spelled out answers to things we hadn't said aloud. It started out with harmless questions, but then it started responding with answers that were way too accurate. It felt like we were tapping into something much deeper than a game. The experience was life-changing in a way I can't quite explain. It made me believe that there is something out there that we just don't understand. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was as if we were connecting with something beyond our comprehension. But at the same time, it felt deeply unsettling. There was a power there that we couldn't control, and it left us both feeling uneasy. The house itself felt different after that night. For the next few months, things started to get weird. The atmosphere in the house changed. It was like there was a dark presence there, a heaviness that we couldn't shake. Doors would open and close on their own. Strange noises echoed through the halls at night, and we both felt like we were being watched. It wasn't just creepy. It was downright terrifying. We never used the Ouija board again, but the after effects lingered long after that night. I still think about that experience sometimes, and while I've come to accept that there are things in this world that we don't understand, I can't deny that it was one of the most unnerving things I've ever gone through. And looking back, I can't help but feel a little grateful that we didn't push too far. Some things are better left unexplored.
Story 7. What did I see?
It was an early morning, the kind of early when the world still feels like it's asleep, and the sun hadn't even begun to rise yet. The streets were empty, the sky a deep, dark grey, and the air felt still, almost too still. I was driving to work, my mind on autopilot, when something made me glance out the window. I swear, my heart nearly stopped. There, just above the horizon, was a massive plane, no lights, no sound, nothing. It was flying so low I could make out the entire outline of its fuselage, reflecting dimly against the faint light of the morning. It was heading in the exact same direction as I was, as if it was following me, or maybe I was following it. The thing that terrified me the most was the utter silence. Not a single sound came from it, no hum of engines, no whoosh of wind, just pure, unnatural silence. The plane glided through the air with an eerie smoothness, so low that it seemed like it could crash into the buildings around me at any moment. I kept staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A military plane. It didn't look like one of the usual commercial jets that fly over the city. There were no lights, no blinking indicators, just that dark silhouette against the sky. It shouldn't have been flying like that, so low, so silent. And why was it so close? I could see the reflections on the metal, the faint shimmer of the fuselage. And yet it moved with such unnerving stillness. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Like the plane knew I was looking at it, like it was aware of my presence. Every nerve in my body screamed that something was wrong. Something wasn't right. But what could it be? I couldn't shake the feeling that the whole thing was wrong. The only thing I knew for sure was that there was a military base just north of my city, an infantry base with an air wing stationed there and a runway. I had always known it was there, but I never paid much attention to it. But this felt connected. What if that plane wasn't supposed to be seen? Maybe it wasn't meant for anyone to notice. And then, as I drove past a certain stretch of highway, my cell phone signal dropped, just like it always did when I passed the base. It wasn't a coincidence. Every time I drove past that base, I lost my signal. And every time I moved a little further down the road, it came back. But it wasn't like any normal cell tower interference. No, this felt deliberate. It was as if something or someone didn't want me or anyone else communicating. The air around me felt heavier now, like I wasn't alone, like there was something out there, something watching. Something that didn't want me to know too much. Something that didn't want me to ask questions. And that plane was a warning. What if I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see? I haven't been able to shake the feeling since. Every time I drive that same route, every time I pass the base, I feel that same sense of unease creep over me again. The silence, the stillness, the strange signals. What was that plane? Why was it there? And why did I feel like I was being hunted? Some things are better left unasked. But I can't stop wondering, what did I really see that morning?
Story 8. An evil watched me.
When I was about 10 years old, I stumbled upon the legend of Wendigos while casually browsing Google. From that moment on, it felt like they were always lurking around me. My friend would mention her town's local Wendigo legend, or I'd read about them in books. But everything escalated after I watched Antlers, a movie about a Wendigo. It was a chilling film, but little did I know the terror was about to spill over into my own life. That very night, after the movie, I received a call from my sister. She had hit a deer on the road and needed help. I rushed to her side. only to find the deer gruesomely splattered across the road. Coyotes were beginning to circle, and I felt this intense, overwhelming presence. Something evil was watching me. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I hurried my sister and myself back home, but that feeling of dread lingered. Over the next 3 months, it felt like something was constantly watching me. Every morning when I walked to my car for work, I could feel an evil presence, like someone or something was right behind me. But the real terror came when I was driving. I'd hear loud knocks on my window and someone screaming my name, but no one else heard it. I had nightmares that felt more real than reality itself, of a creature chasing me, getting closer and closer. One of those dreams was so vivid. I saw myself harming my brother. I woke up in a cold sweat, terrified. One night, while driving at 3 a.m, my car light suddenly went out. I stepped out, and from the woods, I heard a young boy calling my name, begging for help. That was enough to make me jump back into the car and drive away. My lights flickered back on, but the fear didn't stop. This went on for months, until Christmas Eve. I walked into a church where they performed a spiritual blessing. After that, the presence stopped completely. To this day, I can't explain it fully, but I know something evil was following me. Whether it was a Wendigo or not, it's still a mystery, but it terrified me beyond belief.
Story 9. The Faceless Ghost.
When I was around 11 years old, I had a sleepover with a friend. In the middle of the night, he woke me up, whispering urgently. When I opened my eyes, I saw it. A ghost standing right behind him. Before I could react, my friend spoke, his voice trembling. He told me he had just seen the same thing, a ghost. We were both frozen in fear, unable to move or speak, just staring at the dark shape in the room. We didn't know what to do, so we stayed awake, eyes wide, waiting for morning to come. It felt like hours, but the night dragged on. When daylight finally broke, we mustered the courage to get out of bed. In a panic, we decided to separate and draw what we had both seen. When we compared our drawings, we were shocked. They were almost identical: long, flowing outfit, thin, elongated fingers, and most disturbingly, a faceless head. Where a face should have been, there were only deep, pronounced wrinkles, as if it had once had a face that had faded away. In that moment, I promised myself that I would never doubt what I had seen. No matter how strange or impossible it seemed, I knew what I had experienced. But as the years passed, that promise began to fade. I found myself questioning it, wondering if it was just a trick of the mind. Still, I hold on to that moment, that certainty I had back then, though doubt creeps in more and more. To this day, I still remember that ghost, the thing we both saw, and I wonder if it was real after all.
Story 10. The Creepy Mattress.
When I was about 10 or 11 years old, my friend and I were at my auntie's house. We were alone in the house, waiting for my mum and auntie to come home. All of a sudden, we heard a squeaking sound coming from the back room, my cousin's room. We went up the hall to investigate, and as I pushed the door open, we saw my cousin's mattress on his bed gently bouncing up and down, like someone was sitting on it and gently moving up and down. There was no bedding on it at the time, so we could clearly see the mattress moving. The squeaking noise was coming from the wire base of the bed. There was no indentation on the mattress like someone sitting on it. We both just stood there watching it for what must have been at least 10 to 15 seconds. At the time, I remember thinking maybe we were experiencing an earthquake. But I looked around the room and absolutely nothing else was moving or vibrating. Considering the rate the mattress was moving, it would have had to be a pretty strong earthquake. And that would surely affect other things in the room. But nothing else moved, just the mattress with the rhythmic bouncing and noise. I must have been feeling brave at the time, because nowadays I think I'd probably run away screaming. Instead, I went into the room while my friend stayed at the door. I approached the bed and put my hand out to touch the mattress. As soon as I got about a foot away, the mattress stopped dead still. We were both freaked out. We quickly left the room and shut the door firmly behind us. We didn't know what to make of it. And when my auntie and mum returned, we told them the story. My auntie turned pale and said she had heard that noise before, but had never gone to investigate the source. Being the early 1980s, we had no way to record the incident. All I have is the fact that I wasn't the only one who witnessed it. I've even, after telling the story to friends, called her up and put her on speakerphone to corroborate the story, since they wouldn't believe me. Thank goodness I wasn't the only one to see it. I know it sounds far-fetched and like a made-up story, but it happened, and I can't ignore that. As a result, I'm not overly spiritual, but I'm open to all possibilities. I'm grateful for that experience because it opened up my mind at such a young age.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.